In the last video, we talked about how most recessions can be understood by thinking about shocks to aggregate demand. But sometimes we have recession due to an aggregate supply shock. We're going to talk about one example, and an important example of that in this video. In the 1970s, OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, a cartel for oil production, decided to place an embargo on the US, and the price of oil in the US went up dramatically. Now, oil is sort of a special good. It's one of few inputs that is going to increase costs across all markets in the economy. And normally, if there's a supply problem for a product like apples or potatoes, it just affects the market for apples or potatoes, and there are plenty of other substitutes. We didn't really have good substitutes for oil in the 1970s, and basically every product we produce is using oil as an input. Labor is another good that would affect prices across all markets. But here we're talking about oil, and what happened is that the price of oil increased dramatically. That increased production costs across basically all products in the economy. And this led to a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve, or an inward shift in short-run aggregate supply. Now, how do I know that? I know because short-run aggregate supply shifts when we have a change in our expectations about the general price level. And nothing here should affect long-run aggregate supply. We still have mostly the same productive capacity. We have not much impact on, say, aggregate demand, but we do have this increase in the price level reflected across all markets in the economy. So our short-run aggregate supply curve shifts in, and that leads to a recession, a short-term deviation in output away from its long-run potential. And that means recession, decrease in output, but also coupled with inflation, increasing prices. And this is different than what we saw in our aggregate demand shock example, because in the aggregate demand shock example, recession would have been accompanied by deflation or lower levels of inflation. In the short run, we move from A to B. This double whammy of recession and inflation has a special name. It's sometimes called stagflation, because we have a stagnating economy and we also have increasing prices. We could also call this cost push inflation, as opposed to the demand pull inflation that we saw during economic expansions. What happened in this case is that actually eventually oil prices came down. Short-run aggregate supply shifted back to its original point, and we returned back to our long-run equilibrium. This is not very common to have a shock to short-run aggregate supply. It would happen if production costs across all goods in the economy were to increase. We could have a recession with inflation. We worry about that happening if we have shocks to things like oil, labor, or if we have reductions in efficiency or trade. So many economists were quite worried about the trade war with China, that might lead to this sort of a situation. This is not a typical business cycle fluctuation. typically we would conceptualize business cycle fluctuations as being driven by shocks to aggregate demand.